Good morning, everyone. Bonjour à toutes et à tous. For those who don't know me, my name is Florian Martin Barreto. I am the director of the Center for Law, Technology and Society at the University of Ottawa, and I am also an assistant professor within the Commerce section. Je suis très heureux de vous accueillir aujourd'hui pour une autre des conférences du Centre de recherche en droit, technologie et société de l'Université d'Ottawa. And so today we will hear again from our visiting professor, so Professor Carlos Affonso de Souza, who is coming from Brazil. Yeah, for once, I'm not the one in the room with the longest name, so I love to say his name.
Just by one name.
Yeah, so he's visiting us from Brazil, from Rio de Janeiro. He's a professor within the University State of Rio de Janeiro. He is also the director of ITS Rio, the Instituto de Technologia y Sociedad de Rio de Janeiro. And he has like many affiliations. And this term is a visiting professor at the Center for Law, Technology and Society, thanks to the Office of the Vice President Research at the University of Ottawa. So last week he gave us a very interesting talk on quite long, but still very interesting one, on the right to be forgotten, with from a Latin America perspective. And today, as part of his visit, we will discuss a hot topic in North America, but also in Latin America and all over the world. Election and the internet, election and online disinformation. And as you might be aware, Brazil is about to elect his next president. It's a very interesting campaign, to say the least. And so this is what we're gonna discuss today, and without further ado, I will let Carlos speak. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Florian. Bonjour, good morning, everyone. It's really a pleasure to be here with you today. I really have to say thank you to the Center for Law, Technology and Society to allow me to spend this time here in Ottawa. This has been a really productive and a positive experience for me to be able to interact with different faculty members, students, and to get to know a little bit of the law school. It has been really a pleasure to be among you throughout those days. So for our conversation of today, just some housekeeping before we begin. Let's do this as a conversation. So if you have comments, questions, reactions, so let's go around the room. I think we have a very adequate setting for us to make it more as a conversation rather than this being like a structured 45 minutes lecture. So let's make it more a debate. And the topic somewhat end up leading us to this situation on this being a conversation. So what I have planned for our conversation of today. So our broad topic is elections and disinformation. We are going with disinformation and not with fake news because I believe you are pretty much aware of the political usage that can be done by this term, that has been applying to this term, especially after the US elections. So there is an ongoing effort from the academia to come out with a term that might, in a more precise way, portray the moment that we are in all together right now, in which we have this somewhat unique access to information and ways in which information can be spread out, different ways in which people react to information. Some people might come with terms such as information disorder, other will stick with disinformation concept, but most of the people end up agreeing that fake news is something that you end up only using when you want to communicate to a broader audience, definitely outside of a more academic conversation. So we are dropping fake news for a while and sticking with this information for this conversation. I'm focusing mostly on Mexico and Brazil for one particular reason. We end up hearing a lot of politics on US and Europe concerning disinformation. Sometimes Latin America seems to be a little bit out of range, in which this is something that only if you are from this country or you have any particular reason in this region, you end up getting to know a little bit more. And especially this year has been a crucial year for Latin America when it comes on politics, not only having Mexico and Brazil deciding their new president, but specifically seeing how the aftermath of US elections, Brexit, and so on might play out when we think about the role of platforms in Latin America in those very big elections. So my idea for this conversation is for us to go with this structure. I'm going to begin with some cases just to get a good feeling on the ground on what is happening right now, some of recent cases. I'm focusing mostly, of course, on online disinformation. So I want to lead this conversation towards a discussion on what's the role of law in dealing with this phenomenon, if we want to put it that way. And conclude with us, with you, thinking about the role of platforms. So how this whole thing on the battle or the fight against information might lead us to rethink the role of platforms, and that will definitely not only have impacts on issues such as data protection, but also on intermediaries liability regime through different countries. So this is the map that we are following for this conversation. So let me begin very quickly with examples, and I wanted to keep it very updated. So this is Friday in Brazil. We got this very interesting decision by one of the justice members of our Supreme Court that has prohibited one of the biggest newspapers in Brazil to conduct an interview with Lula. Lula is a former president of Brazil. He has been our president for 2 times, and he's now in jail. So he's been through a process, a judicial process that analyzed claims on corruption incidents during his administration, and he was condemned, and he's now in jail. Question is, until we got a final decision by our electoral courts, if even being in jail, if he was able to run or not for president, for the presidency, and that has changed like a month and a half ago, when finally we got a decision saying this guy could not run for president. So there was a lot of discussions on what's the legal status of someone who is running for president, but he is condemned, so he is in jail right now. Is this guy a legitimate candidate? What are the ways in which a campaign around a candidate that is in jail can be conducted? As you can, I'm beginning with this very single case because for some of you that might be almost realistic to discuss a situation like this one. And what ended up happening is that now we have a clear picture. So he's not running for presidency, he's in jail, but one of the biggest newspapers wanted to conduct an interview with him to get his opinions on the elections, that the first round it's set to happen this weekend. So we are like 7 days, 6 days actually, to the actual voting of the first round of the Brazilian elections. And then there was a decision from another justice from the Supreme Court allowing this interview to be conducted. Last Friday, while the president of the court was away, another justice revoked the previous decision, saying that this interview could never be done because it will create fake news, it will create disinformation in a moment that is very close to the actual voting on the Brazilian elections. So why I'm beginning with this case? First of all, because it shows how complicated the situation in Brazil, for instance, might be in a situation in which you have someone who has was a candidate in this election like a month ago, and now we have the situation in which at least one justice from our Supreme Court says that this is going to be fake news, this is going to be disinformation, so I'm not allowing this person to give out an interview. And he even uses expressions such as, this is an exceptional restriction to freedom of speech because elections are at stake. So this justice used to be the president of our electoral court. And when he was a president of our electoral court, he was in the press, in the media, a bunch of times saying that elections in Brazil could be canceled if there is enough evidence that the election result was a direct result of a disinformation process, of fake news. So this is a very delicate moment that we're going in Brazil, that we've been through in Brazil right now. And as you can see, this decision is, just to begin with, interesting for our conversation because it's almost like a minority report of some sort, like the justice analyzing the situation, think that the speech that this person is going to deliver, it's going to be something that is going to disinform people near the elections. So preventively, he avoided this interview to be conducted. This is how complex the situation on the ground is right now. And this is last Friday, so this is definitely developing throughout this week. And since we're talking about Brazil and Mexico, let me give this one example that it's interesting because it ended up putting the two countries together, not in a soccer match, as you would imagine. I like to use this photo because that's a photo of the Brazil-Mexico soccer match in the World Cup of this year. As you might know, Brazil went well. We're getting used to that. It was not 7-1, so it's good enough, but at least we won over Mexico. But the fact is, no rivalry whatsoever, all good friends. But the fact is, when we think about the relationship between Brazil and Mexico when it comes to elections, there is a direct relation that brings us to this conversation today. And this is very interesting because it ended up leading to some action by Facebook in Brazil and in Mexico. So what happened? We already had the elections in Mexico, and some very interesting interactions were diagnosed by Facebook on the Mexican elections. So let's begin with this one. So we have some very large pages on Brazilian Facebook with numbers such as 5 million users that end up being used to criticize some candidates in the Mexican election. So we might say, so are Brazilians that much interest in Mexican politics? So like why a 5 million user Brazilian Facebook page end up being so engaged in Mexican politics? So this is a very interesting case, and we might look into 2 Facebook pages. And this comes from a digital forensic research lab from the Atlantic Council report. So there is one Brazilian Facebook page called Frases e Versos, phrases and verbs. It's a very interesting page to look at. So in 2 Facebook pages, dealing with the Mexican elections, so No Pé Reúno and Hablando de Política, you had a lot of interactions from Brazilian users. But it's very interesting that the way that the Brazilian users end up liking the pages or liking the posts on those pages was definitely not organic. And how do we know this was not organic? Because they happened almost in the same order. So look at what happened. So those are the likes on those 2 pages on Mexican elections coming from Brazil. All those users are also users or Facebook users of this other Brazilian Facebook page called Frases em Versos. As you can see, the order of the likes are pretty much the same. So this is definitely not organic. So this is like 2 Mexican elections pages having their voice enlarged by Brazilian users that comes from Brazilian pages. As you can see from this report, the reactions to the Mexican post therefore seem to come from a Brazilian operation which is specialized in providing artificial boosts to Facebook posts. It's common, a like form that we are pretty much aware of. The distinctive fact that might trigger our interest in looking to Brazil for that purpose is that we have in Brazil a quite common habit since the times of Orkut. Do you guys know what Orkut is? It was a social network created by Google 10 years ago, was like super famous in Brazil, in India, not that much in the US, not sure about Canada. Like 15 years ago, when you were doing your social network, where are you at? MySpace? MySpace mostly, yeah. So MySpace was never like the big thing that it was in the US and Canada. For us, it was Orkut. The Brazilians in the room certainly might have very emotional reactions to Orkut and the way that we were able to engage in communication at that time. So that was a social network created by Google at the time. And different from Facebook, that ended up organizing pages, on Orkut, people organize themselves in communities. So you end up subscribing to one specific community. And the community end up gathering a large number of users around topics as crazy as I usually sleep at work, I hate working on Mondays, or like whatever crazy topic that will be. And the fact is, at Orkut, slowly end up being created a movement that we can call in Brazil PCSD, which stands for Pego Comunidade Sem Dono, or I get communities that don't have an owner, that without owner. So communities who are abandoned, or the owner are not coordinating the activities of this community anymore. So they're slowly end up evolving a process of selling out those communities to people who might want to profit from them. Profit doing what? Well, they have a captive audience there, like already engaged on one specific topic. So after you collected a large number of users engaged in this community, if people want to make out some money, so why not sell this community to some other people? Problem is, under the terms of service of those social networks, that's definitely a practice that is going to be prohibited. That very same practice ends up migrating to Facebook. And you have a large group of people that end up getting specialized in selling Facebook pages in Brazil. And that community end up keeping the very same name of PCSD. So if you take a look on some of those pages, and Frases e Versos might look something similar to that. So a couple of very interesting features. So those are a couple of followers of Frases em Versos. As you can see, a lot of people from India. Not sure what there is like so funny in like phrases and verses in Portuguese for Indian users. But the fact is that PCSD was growing larger and larger on Facebook. And because of that, it's interesting for us to take a look how that operated. So they had a lot of different pages. The official one, PCSD Forever, Register of Transactions, Help Desk. So it's interesting to see that in one of those pages it was pretty much clear what was the purpose. To bring together all Facebook page managers to exchange knowledge, negotiations, and profits using the social network. So the aim was pretty much clear. They even have, in some of the cases, people taking out screenshots of the receipts of payments to make proof that payment was done, so the Facebook page could be transferred. As you can imagine, this is a terms of service violation, and those are just screenshots on people buying and selling Facebook pages. Facebook ended up doing a crackdown on this network of pages under not only the prohibition of buying and selling Facebook pages, but also connected to a larger effort of Facebook in Brazil to, before elections, make sure that not only the practice of selling pages could be at least restricted, because what was the fear here? That people would buy one Facebook page having 5 million users, and it was something related to comedy, humor, or something whatsoever, and then when election comes close, it turns by from one day to the other into a highly politicized Facebook page, and then you can claim that, hey, this politician has like 5 million supporters on Facebook. And that was getting into such a hot topic in Brazil, especially with the guy who is leading the polls right now in Brazil, called Jair Bolsonaro. It's creating a very divisive situation in Brazil right now. Some people love him. Some people see him as the rise of fascism in Brazil. There was a huge demonstration in Brazil this weekend under the hashtag ele não, which is like he no, or not him. A lot of international artists end up joining up this movement, such as Madonna. I'm not sure if any Canadian artists end up joining up. I'm not sure. I haven't checked Justin Bieber account this weekend, or Bryan Adams. But the fact is, there is a lot of discussion going on in Brazil right now because of this candidate and because of the things that he's been saying, that he's pro-torture, that he is not a fan of LGBT community, that he either rather die than having a gay son, or things like that. So it's a really extreme language being used right now on Brazilian elections. But the fact is, there was this huge protest, this huge demonstration Saturday throughout Brazil against this candidate. There was another demonstration in favor of him in São Paulo on Sunday, so that you can see this is divisive as it can be. And this feature of Facebook could be easily exploited to say that this candidate has 5 million supporters. And that could be done easily, just buying a Facebook page, which is not expensive, but definitely it is an infringement of the terms of use. And we even had a situation, I don't have slides for that, but we even had a situation like this last week. There was a huge, I think, 2 million maybe, Facebook page, Women Against Bolsonaro, who has been hacked and then turned into Women in Favor of Bolsonaro. So there was a huge commotion when the group was invaded, and the managers of the group they were expelled, and then they turned the group the opposite way around in terms of political message. So this is why Facebook's acting in Brazil in trying to restrict a bit the way in which pages could be used for political reasons, and to artificially enlarge the way in which speech is being done on Brazilian internet. So Facebook ended up doing a crackdown on a couple of pages. Let me go quickly here. I want to talk about Mexico a bit, just to show that you might have the same standard when it comes to the Mexican elections. There was a lot of news reporting about the king of fake news in Mexico, the guy from Victory Lab. Not sure if you heard about this, but it's really interesting to see. So if you take a look on Carlos Merlo, who is the consultant to Victory Lab. So Victory Lab on Facebook is really interesting. They have a lot of Asian followers, and if you take a look on some of the posts that have been made, so this is one interview that this guy gave out to the TV. And as you can see, you have a lot of likes here. So as you can see in this post, you have this guy giving out this interview, and you have 3.5K likes. This is really strange that like 3.5K people end up reacting to one post, but all of them reacting with a like button. Like no one reacted with a love button, a laugh button, or end up creating a comment or whatsoever. So this might be artificially inflating one type of speech on Facebook, done poorly, you might say, but that's exactly what Facebook is going after right now and end up going after in Mexico. So this is just a couple of screenshots on Victory Lab page on Facebook, and it's interesting that they have a lot of Brazilian users that like the page as well. As you can imagine, all of those users are users of our Facebook pages that we have been mentioned since the beginning. And of course, you have a lot of fake profiles. So this one is using the photo of this British glamour grandmother. I really have to say I didn't know her until I prepared those slides. You have this other one that is taking a profile picture of an Instagram model. I had no idea there was such a thing as Instagram model as well. We learn a lot when we prepare slides for presentations. And let me conclude this very long introduction, but that concludes the first part of our conversation with this incident that happened in Rio this year, the assassination of city councilor Marielle. So this is Marielle. She was a city councilor in Rio. She was assassinated 4 months ago. Still no clue of who ended up ordering the assassination, who ended up being the authors of this crime. But the fact is, at the very same day that the news of her death ended up spreading out on the internet, this photo ended up being sent quite a lot. And people was sending out this photo saying this was her and this is a drug dealer. Saying that she was a wife of this drug dealer, got pregnant, and then that she was assassinated because of a battle between two rival factions of drug dealers of two communities in Rio. That was a clear disinformation effort, because she was pretty much connected to left-wing movements, and people from the opposite political spectrum wanted to show that she was not a martyr whatsoever. She was such a victim of the dispute of two drug dealers in Rio. So there was a lot of effort to prove that this photo was definitely being used as a fake news campaign. But as you can expect, this was not only sent out in the internet by people who wanted to position themselves on a right-wing spectrum, but even politicians end up using this very same misguided information and end up tweeting and posting about it. So this is a congressman saying, no, right now the new martyr of the left. Marielle got pregnant at 16 years. She was ex-wife of a drug dealer. She's a marijuana addict. She was defending the rival faction of the drug dealer. She was elected by the drug dealers. She fired recently 6 employees. Oh, but of course, the one who killed her, it was the police officers. So this is a congressman that pretty much tries to voice out law enforcement agents' concerns in the Congress, and is he like using for political gains this very sad situation that happening in Rio, and we see that a lot happening in Brazilian internet right now. And we even have a judge from the Court of Appeals of Rio de Janeiro saying the very same thing. So this is really tricky, because one thing is like people and bots on the internet spreading out fake news. The other one is when you have congressmen, judges, high court judges spreading out the very same language that was there on the fake news reports and the fake news posts that you have the first time. So this is just to give you a good example of what's going on in the ground in Brazil and in Mexico when it comes to fake news, elections, and so on. Is everything okay up here? Do you have any questions, comments? No? So let's move ahead then. For those of you who are not here on my first talk here at the law school, I didn't know we had to stop at 12:50. I thought we were supposed to go up to 1 p.m. So for those of you who were here, let me take this time to extend my apologies for locking you in the room for definitely extra time that I was supposed to do. So I'm really sorry about that. I'm not repeating the mistakes again today. So let's move to the second part. Okay, so what's the law has to do with it? Is there any way that law could serve as a way to fix this problem? And well, when we make this question, first of all, it's important for us to take some notice that law in itself is not the only way to address this issue. Of course, there is social, economic, technological layers that we definitely want to pay attention when we address this problem. Law is not the silver bullet that will take away all fake news from this world, but law might play a role, and this is important for us to understand which role is that. And this might lead us to re-examine our 2 decades on tackling the topic of internet intermediaries liability and the role of platforms if we want to be on a more broader conversation on this topic. So if we go back to mid-90s, we will see that in the US, you end up having 2 pieces of legislation that address the role of platforms when it comes to third-party content. One is the Communication Decency Act that we have back then in 1996. I believe you're pretty much aware, but Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act says that an internet provider shall now be treated as publisher of a third-party content. For us in Latin America, this is really interesting because that's usually not the way. If we would frame a law on intermediary liability, definitely using this language and the way to do comparison between a provider and an editor or publisher, that's definitely not the way we used to word this and framing our legislation on those topics. But it's interesting to see that in mid-90s you had this piece of legislation. You know that a good chunk of the CDA ended up being recognized as unconstitutional, but Section 230 is there saying that providers shall not be held liable by third-party contents as publishers, and should not be deemed liable as publishers. And then we have, by the end of the 1990s, the DMCA, the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, that specifically for copyright creates a notice and take down provision, saying that once providers are not liable for content, for infringing content of copyright until the moment that they receive a notification that the content is there. When they receive this content, they have to take it down. So notice and take down provision on the MCA back in the end of the 1990s. The reason I'm going back to 1990s is just for us, first of all, to understand that this is not a super new topic that was like invented last year. So we have been discussing throughout those decades the way in which we understand how platforms operate and if they should or not be held liable for third-party content. I know that right now might be a little bit cheesy or outdated to talk about Web 2.0. This looks like, oh my God, like 15 years ago. But it's interesting to see that creating those sorts of regimes for intermediary liability end up being the very, the very source that end up allowing Web 2.0 to be firmly grounded on legal grounds, on legal stance, that platforms will not at first be held liable for third-party content. The fact is, coming to our to the days that we are living today, do the very same thoughts, do the very same reasoning that we fought back in 1990s. Is it still valid? Does it still apply? Does it need any revision? And if it does need any revision, which revision is that? So my concern here is that when people very eagerly turn to this topic to say platforms need to be more responsible, but what do they mean? Because some of the problems that sometimes people end up connecting to Section 230 of the CDA, well, they might not be faults of the CDA itself. So it's interesting for us to see how different spectrums of this conversation might be deployed and how this connects to the issue of elections and fake news. And the reason I'm mentioning this is because, of course, due to all this confusion that we saw on people buying and selling pages, artificially increasing the volume of one specific speech online, platforms are trying to restrict this type of operations. Platforms are doing some management of their of the platform, of the collective usage of this resource. But the question is, once they do this, are they giving away the exception of liability? And one specific topic that relates to Latin America. Usually, when we speak in English about the change from intermediary liability to intermediary responsibility, that might sound pretty well in English. That doesn't make any sense, either in Portuguese or in Spanish. Because on legal grounds, on a legal standpoint, when we talk about intermediary liability, liability for us is translated as responsabilidade or responsabilidade. So responsibility is already the way that we talk about this very same issue in Spanish and Portuguese speaking countries. And the reason I'm mentioning this is I know how important to get to the very right words is important for us to communicate what we want to address and what we want to achieve. We don't need to go any further. It's just to look at fake news, how powerful this concept ended up being So this is just to say, if we move ahead with the idea of platform responsibility, that might alienate at least a good chunk of Portuguese and Spanish-speaking countries. So go ahead.
Yes, it's very interesting. And your talk on, when was it, Thursday? Thursday, was it?
Mm-hmm.
It was very interesting, so no worries about speaking
Wednesday.
too long. It was very informative, so we learned a lot. So thank you very much.
Me too. I learned from the
Yeah.
mistakes of the past.
And on your topic, there's quite a lot of elements to take into consideration. The first, I think that you're perfectly right that the legal response cannot be the only one. That
Mhm.
it's actually now the states, when they are intervening into a matter, they usually consider not only the legal aspect, but also intervention in terms of, influencing the market, or that comes back to your talk on Thursday, influencing the norms, sensibilization over certain issues. But in the case of immunity, I'm coming more from the copyright aspect of things and
Mhm.
publisher activities. And the solution, or at least in the old time, the solution was not to just infer liability, responsibility, and that's it. They would draft the liability according to circumstances. So we have a very, very old law in Quebec that say a publisher can only be responsible for some damages, not all damages. So they decided which damages he would be responsible for, and he had a device. He could publish saying that what he had said was wrong. He could publish the answer, and then the liability would go, up to zero.
Mm-hmm.
So they, instead of saying it's all liability, no liability, they designed something that was more to the specific issues, fact-oriented.
Mm-hmm.
And for election, they said that, you could not publish something before election. That was the rule, and actually it says in our election act, that, for some time before the election, newspapers are not to publish anything because they know that if they publish just the day before, nobody will have the time to correct the information. So that was another measure where they were more fact-oriented. Okay, what's the time before the election where you should not allow people to print anything? And on the non-liability, they would say also, depends what you're publishing.
Mm-hmm.
If you're accusing somebody of a criminal action, that's the worst. So there, you cannot say you're not liable. If it's other material that you're publishing, then you have this lesser liability and proceeding to get yourself out of the liability. So I think that in the debate on the intermediary, it's like they decided to put a system, whatever were the facts,
Mhm.
and that's either overprotective or underprotective of either the intermediaries or of the public.
And that's thank you for your comment, Professor. That's really interesting to see that sometimes we end up getting entangled on the two extremes, either saying providers are not to be held liable as a whole, and on the other side you have people saying you end up being not only the one who have the largest pockets, but have the means to end up acting fast, so you should be the one being held liable. But sometimes we lose track on this middle ground in between those two extremes. And thank you very much for this comment, because I think it really addresses, specifically comes to elections, that we have some other resources that we want to play along. For instance, right to reply. So it might be even better for the person who is attacked to have a window of opportunity in which his version of the story can be told in the very same way, addressing the very same audience. And the fact is how to engineer a right to reply that is effective on social networks. So, for instance, two very quick comments. After the US elections, so right now in Brazil, Facebook is rolling out the transparency in terms of political ads. So when you see a political ads in the Brazilian internet, you see the social security number of the person who has paid for these ads, and at the law, only the politician, the candidate, the party, or the group of party that end up, the coalition that end up supporting these candidates are able to end up paying for publicity, for political propaganda to be done in the internet in Brazil. So that's the rule that was crafted for this election, saying that's what we call impulsionamento. Which is interesting because impulsionamento in Portuguese, it's a word that's pretty much connected to Facebook. But of course, you can have paid political propaganda in other platforms as well. So it's somewhat, in terms of legislative technique, it's definitely not the best approach to have this sort of wording inserted into the electoral rules, because it's pretty much focused on one platform. But interesting enough, when you see the numbers in terms of paid political ads on Facebook on this election, the guy who is number one in the polls, Jair Bolsonaro, he's probably the one who have paid less, because he's resorting to other forms of disseminating his expression online, which is through WhatsApp groups. So it's interesting to see that different platforms might offer different ways in which a speech might be delivered. And that's interesting because, addressing the professor's comments, if we think about right to reply, for instance, as something that the platform can do to reduce the liability that it might pay, right to reply might happen on Facebook on one way, Twitter other way, WhatsApp, with end-to-end encryption, how can you do it? So just a quick comment on that. So let's go here and there.
Can I ask which age groups are most likely to vote on the elections, if you know, in the past?
I would say mostly from 18 to 45. It's a really large. And I have to say it's mandatory to vote in Brazil. So, of course, you might decide not to, and then you pay a small fine. But it's a small detail.
Interesting. Okay.
So, go ahead.
So my question is, when making these laws and regulatory frameworks, how much is there fear of making them too strict so that you end up essentially having Chinese policies, right, where then you're liable for absolutely everything, which makes people either not use certain sites or not be able to express certain opinions because of this. Second, just to add to Professor's comments, in Canada we're also having a very interesting debate where things have changed, at least federally, on how you can report election results. It used to be that you couldn't, right? So if you had election results from Newfoundland or New Brunswick, you couldn't report it until BC had closed. That way you wouldn't have, because there's different time zones involved, right? So that way you wouldn't have any skewing or different voter reactions. But because of social media, Elections Canada has had to change that, because it was impossible now to enforce, because you would have people on Twitter saying, oh yeah, I voted this, and so on, whether or not it was real results, right? They've now had to change that. So we'll see how that impacts on voting in Canada, because we don't have enough data yet. But for people in BC voting, when they already know what most of the country has voted, why am I going to bother going to vote? Or, how it will impact stuff.
In Brazil, we would have like only 2 time zones, so it's pretty much easier. So we vote in Rio and we wait for another hour for our friends in the West to finish voting, and then we end up going. And it's electronic vote in Brazil, so you don't vote on paper. you vote on electronic ballot machine. So it's interesting that we end up having our elected president, maybe if the elections close at 6 p.m. Late at night, we might have our results. So it's really fast. And on the other hand, that end up creating space for people to claim that the electoral machines are being attacked and there is fraud on the elections. How can we audit the software that end up making the elections running, especially when you think that the last presidential election was a really tight election, which was almost like 51-49%, if you think of it. So it's really tricky. So in the interest of time, let me just finish the second part, jumping straight to the Brazilian example. I'm not going to spend some time here on the international framework. Let me go into the Brazilian scenario. So we have specific laws for the Brazilian election that were approved by the electoral court, and they are like really interested on themselves. If you have any doubts and questions, I'll be more than happy to speak later on to you on that. But let me quote, or let me refer to one specific provision from the so-called Brazilian Internet Bill of Rights. So Brazil has a law, a federal law, was approved in 2014 called Marco Civil da Internet, Brazilian Internet Bill of Rights. Article 19 deals with intermediary liability. It's a very interesting rule because it says that in order to protect free speech and to prevent censorship, the internet applications provider, not the best translation, sorry, can only be held liable for damage resulting from content created by third parties if, after a specific order, it does not take any steps to, within the technical limitations of the service and the time stated in the order, make unavailable the content that was identified as being unlawful. So, what does it mean? It means that a provider should only be held liable if it fails to comply with the judicial order. Does it mean that a provider could only take down a content in the Brazilian internet with a judicial order? No. Platforms are free to take down content if they identify this content as being against their terms of service, if it's infringing of the terms of service, of the community guidelines. The platform could go ahead and take down this one content, but they only will be held liable for this third-party content if they fail to comply with a judicial order. This is a big departure from a notice and take down regime. So in trying to understand why this law was crafted this way, we end up being pretty much involved in the whole process that ended up leading to the discussions that got the law the way it is. You might see that in Brazil, in the last 15 years, we have 3 waves of interpretation of intermediary liability. The first one would say that providers, all providers, they would be held liable under a strict liability regime. So under a strict liability regime, or responsabilidade objetiva, responsabilidade objetiva, in Portuguese or Spanish, you will not look into fault-based liability. You might hold this platform liable only because the content was there. And that was pretty much what has been discussed not only in Brazil, but in other countries in Latin America, were providers to be held liable for third-party content through a strict liability lens. Brazil rejects this theory. Argentina as well. Argentina has 2 judicial decisions by the Supreme Court of Argentina rejecting the regime of strict liability for internet application providers, of course, for third-party content. So that was the first phase. Second phase, a fault liability regime focusing on a notice and takedown, a proper notice and takedown system. So before the Brazilian Internet Bill of Rights was approved, we had a lot of judicial decisions saying, okay, so strict liability regime might impose a very sensitive restriction on free speech, because platforms will be held liable just because someone else posted something there. That might be really tricky in terms of balancing free speech with other rights. So let's switch to a notice and take down regime. Why is it better? Because it does not impose on platforms the duty to monitor the platform and being held liable just because something was posted there. With notice and take down, we transfer to the party who is the victim, to the person who end up feeling damaged by this content, to notify the platform that this harmful content is being posted there. And once this is done, if the platform does not take action, then the platform is to be held liable. So that was what we had in Brazil before the Brazilian International Bill of Rights. Why Brazil ended up departing from a notice and take down regime? Because even a notice and take down regime could not be not only abused at some point, but we end up seeing that most of the platforms might end up resorting to the takedown of the content and not going, of course, to fight for this content once notified. And that could create a lot of situations in which free speech was still not adequately protected. But what is the criticism of this third wave, such to say, that we have now in the law? Well, first of all, we have people saying that content could only be took down after a judicial decision, which is definitely what's not there in the wording. The wording talks about liability, not about the removal of the content. Some people might say that will create a more litigation on content online. The way to reduce this criticism, the law ended up indicating that small claims court could be used to dispute those facts. So small claims courts in Brazil, you don't even need a lawyer to file a lawsuit. An injunction can be very quickly obtained. So that was a way to reduce the criticism here. But that's interesting, because Brazil ended up crafting in the law the idea of something that on Europe might end up being worked out on case law. So the whole circumstance of intermediate liability under the e-commerce directive, saying that the actual notice of an infringing content is the issuing of a judicial order, is something that is done in the case law in Europe. In Brazil, it's there in the law in order to protect free speech. I could go over longer on that, but let me try to move. Oh, this is the small claims courts. And let me just say that this provision has some exceptions. The first exception is content involving nudity and non-consented scenes of sex being posted online. So if there is a non-consensual dissemination of pictures, videos involving sexual activities or nudity, we go back to a notice and take down regime. So that's Article 21 of the Brazilian International Bill of Rights. So that is one exception. Issues concerning child pornography is an exception as well, but it's on a different law. And what is interesting, we have one exception on copyright as well. But on copyright, the exception is different from Article 21. On copyright, since there is an ongoing debate of reforming the copyright law in Brazil, what the Brazilian International Bill of Rights does is just to say when the copyright reform in Brazil ends up happening, the copyright law will tackle the issue of copyright infringement and intermediary liability. So this is just to say that there are some exceptions to this rule. Let me move to the final topic of our conversation. which is what to expect from platforms. And let me go back to the Brazilian scenario. So, Brazilian politics has been a soap opera. There is like sometimes hard to follow. Do you guys here in Canada watch a lot of Mexican soap operas? Are they famous?
A little bit.
Not that much.
A little bit, yeah. I've seen a few.
Oh, really? Okay, good. So, so it's always good to have someone who has appreciation for good and complex narratives. Slightly dramatic at some point, but
Slightly, yes.
yeah, but definitely good ones. Brazilians and Mexican soap operas are really good and very dramatic, very complex, but nothing could come close to the fantastic reality of our politics. So 2 years ago, Brazil ended up having its president, was she actually, impeached. And one group that was really important for this moment was a group that is not a party. It's actually like a group that ended up using a lot social networks called MBL, Movimento Brasil Livre. And this is a highly organized group that ended up being important in those demonstrations. And it's important to say I'm not getting into any sides of the political spectrums here, just to report to you on something that happens. So this group ended up being targets of another Facebook action to take down content. So what happened? Facebook ended up removing a lot of pages in Brazil, some of them connected to this group. The claim that the Facebook ended up doing was that, almost similar to the one that we saw in the beginning of this presentation, is that they would be artificially enlarging some specific speech on the internet, and that ended up leading to them to claim that Facebook was doing some censorship. That's because they are a very right-wing movement, and Facebook was leading towards a more left-wing approach. Well, you don't need me to tell you that how similar this is to the debate that you have on InfoWars in the US, and people claiming that, oh, the internet platforms, they are leaning towards a more leftist approach, and Twitter is shadow banning right-wing users. So it's interesting for you to know that this is not only a discussion that you might have in the US and Canada, somewhat in Europe, but it's happening in Latin America, almost the very same script, almost the very same narrative. So you have this very influential right-wing movement saying we are being censored on Facebook. And it was really interesting because they end up, when this is happening, two comments. So first, they end up putting up a camping tents in front of Facebook office in São Paulo and stay there for 3 days protesting and shouting aloud on microphones and such, and claiming about the censorship that was happening. But it's interesting for us to take a look on how the company ended up operating in this situation. Like, agreeing or not with what has happened, there is one point that we might want to take a closer look, which is how companies, when they decide to manage their platform, how they communicate to the users affected what is going on. And this is the warning or the message that the Facebook users received in Brazil. If you think about transparency, so this is what Facebook ended up saying to the users affected. Deactivated, rejected. We determined that you are not qualified to use Facebook. This is a final decision. Unfortunately, for security reasons, we cannot provide you any additional information on the reasons of this deactivation of your account. If you want to know more about our politics, visit our terms of service. So this is not informative enough. So if you might agree or disagree with portraying this as censorship, definitely there is a need for growing and increasing transparency by the platforms when they decide to manage their own resources, and then banning, suspending, restricting some specific content. And that is the scenario that we are moving into right now. And elections are the moment in which this type of questioning become increasingly important. If platforms do not fulfill some very basic transparency needs right now, they are bringing closer to their home base the idea of having a regulation that might end up obliging them to do this way or that way. So if we think that, I know that might sound super silly to think that on the 2 last decades, all the regulation on internet on the US is pretty much targeting to fostering innovation. And on the other hand, you might see that Europe is now pushing for a regulation on some specific issues to protect the users in a different standpoints, such as data protection, and now you have some other regulations coming up, and you have the revision of the European directive on copyright. Well, the fact is that we need to improve due process claims and transparency by the platforms, because if that is not done, what we will have is a repetition of this type of expression, like the president of the USA saying that it's dangerous when companies like Twitter regulate own content. So you end up getting this a lot. And it's interesting to see how this could lead us to a very different regulations scenario. I really like this quote from Daphne Keller from the Stanford Center for Internet Society, when reacting to Trump's repeated discourses on saying that it's dangerous for Twitter to manage their own platform, saying that there is a clear commercial reason for platforms to weed out content of this sort, since it alienates both users and advertisers. But the thing is, if there is a commercial reason for you to do so, some other people might say, but that will decrease the number of users in the platforms. So the number of users is a way in which shareholders end up analyzing the profitability of a platform. If you end up carving out some users because the language is toxic, the way that they behave is infringing the terms of service, how can we find a balance that might be interest for the platform? And coming to a discussion on intermediary liability regimes, well, we talk about InfoWars. It's interesting to see that different solutions might end up appearing here and there. And this is one op-ed. It was published on the Wall Street Journal last month, arguing for the need to create multi-stakeholder content groups that would have academia, civil society, tech companies, maybe governments, giving out standards on how to address complex issues and controversial contents. I have some concerns on the idea of having a group such as this, not only how this group can be captured, how this can be enforceable, if that's going to be just a suggestion, how different platforms might apply those recommendations, because as we have said, when it comes to Google, it's all about the indexing and delisting. When it comes to Facebook, is the removal of accounts and pages and users. Some other company might feel that you might suspend this account for a number of days, and then this person might rejoin the network. So it's interesting for us to play along with different ways to tackle this issue, especially on elections. And well, I hope this was informative enough on what's going on Brazil and in Mexico. Just a final remarks on the elections in Brazil. We have the voting on Sunday. I'm coming back to Brazil to fulfill my my duty as citizen, and it's a very interesting moment for the country. It looks like from the polls that we are going to have a second round with this guy who is leading the poll right now. That is very divisive, as I had mentioned, and the candidate from the Labour's Party, which is the party from former President Lula, that we began the conversation talking about him. So it's interesting because on one hand it's almost a return from this what happened before this 2-year period in which we got the impeachment. So the vice president ended up, Michel Temer, being our president right now. As strange as it might seem, the vice president ended up doing opposition to what the impeached president ended up doing, but it's a complicated, don't ask me. But the fact is, seems like Brazilians are going to have those two options. One is to vote this very divisive candidate. Some people love him, some people hate him. And the other is to come back to what happened in the government from the Labour's Party that had been ruling Brazil for 13 years. Some people are not happy with the two options, but well, democracy ended up leading us to taking decisions. So Brazilians will have to decide on those two options, and it's going to be really interesting to see what comes out from these elections in Brazil, and I'm pretty sure we will have a lot of other examples of disinformation and fake news happening in Brazil in the following month. I'll be around for a while, and even if you're not here in Ottawa, please do feel free to contact me. I had just some final slides talking about how to tackle the issues of fake news in Brazilian elections. One is using the companies and entities that end up doing fact-checking in Brazil are creating bots that end up replying with the information on issues on fake news. There is a really good one called Fatima, created by Aos Fatos, which is a fact-checker entity in Brazil. And we ourselves on ITS, we created one called Pega Bot, which is like the bot hunter, which is like you put your Twitter handle and then we might say if you're a bot or not. Has been working so far, has been working so well that if you put the Twitter handle, oh me, I'm still undecided if I'm a bot or not, but well, it's working out. If you get the Robocop Twitter account, you see that's definitely a bot, so it's a sign that we're doing some progress. So this is just a couple of examples what's going on in Mexico and Brazil. Hope that's helpful. If you need any further information on that or want to keep in contact, I would love to continue this conversation afterwards. So that's my mail. Professor Florian has my contacts as well. I would love to continue this conversation with you. Thank you.